I'd like to share some of the interesting aspects of racism and the caste system that Isabel Wilkerson talks about in her book, particularly those dealing with health issues and some of the subtleties that come in terms of race relations and how it kind of affects us, and sometimes ways that we don't even think of or aware of. And this kind of helps us in terms of our own reflections about where we are with racism ourselves. One of the interesting aspects she points out is the Stockholm Syndrome and how it applies to this whole concept of race relations. Uh, in the Stockholm Syndrome, of course, the person who is abused in some way identifies with the abuser. And when you think of it in terms of that, uh, there are ways that people may be discriminated against, and they really are not aware of them. And, again, it can be very subtle in terms of how it kind of creeps into a person. One of the examples she uses is a white police officer. And this white police officer in 2019, she killed a black person. She killed a person in his own apartment, and she was found guilty. She, obviously did the wrong thing. The person was in their own apartment, and they were killed, and it was totally her fault. She was to blame, and she was given 10 years in prison. Which, when you think about it, for killing somebody, it seemed really like a light sentence to a lot of people, and it didn't seem like a sentence that a black person would have been given for shooting a white person. A lot of people commented on that at the time and said, it seems kind of crazy that type of sentence. Um, but the interesting thing about it was she was forgiven, and she was hugged by the black man's brother. Um, and the black bailiff comforted her and actually stroked her hair. Um, and when you think about it, um, you know, it's kind of crazy here. And there was a black judge, and the black judge gave her a Bible. So again, here is a white person doing something to a black person, and all these black people are like kind of comforting her, and was this appropriate? Certainly, there were nice gestures that were made, but in terms of fairness, in terms of justice, in terms of equity, it sort of raised the question: Is the people who are being abused really, in some ways, identifying with the abuser in terms of this type of behavior? Another example that she mentions is the story of Davonte Hart. He was seen at a protest in Portland, Oregon, with a sign that said "Hug me," and he was being abused by two white women, along with four of the children that they had fostered. And he was a black child abused by white women, and eventually these women killed themselves and the children as they drove their van off a cliff, because the authorities were kind of closing in on them. So here is, again, a situation where you have a young man who is black, and these foster women are abusing him, and you kind of wonder, what's going on here? Why wasn't this picked up on more quickly by people and seen? And unfortunately, it wasn't, and it led to the death of the children. Also, sometimes we see a demand for forgiveness from the dominant caste, and they demand that from those in the lower caste who have been harmed. For example, in the church shooting in Charleston, I mean, it was very nice of the people to offer that forgiveness, but is there this demand on, the lower caste from the higher caste that you must forgive? We've done something wrong, we've harmed you, somebody in the, upper caste, the white group has harmed you, but, you've got to be forgiving. You've got to rise above it. And is this demand for forgiveness really an appropriate reaction? There was a young boy in the grocery store in the city, and he was falsely accused of a sexual assault. And the video kind of showed that and cleared the person. And they asked the reporters and people, said, well, are you going to forgive this woman? I mean, she accused you falsely. Are you going to forgive her? And he said, I'm not going to forgive her. She needs help. that was his reaction. And Isabel Wilkerson comments and says, well, he was young. He didn't, get the message that, hey, you're from the lower caste. You must forgive those from the upper caste. This forgiveness thing must play out. And if it doesn't, well, gee, why aren't you forgiving? This woman did something that was totally inappropriate. She should be forgiven. You're from the other caste. And he said, she's crazy. She made this whole thing up about, I sexually assaulted. I was just a little kid in the store getting some stuff, and she made this stuff up. And, again, you think, well, why do people make something like that up that is so inappropriate, so crazy, so, no basis in fact? Again, they think they can get away with it. They're from the upper caste. This was somebody in the lower caste. They're going to believe me. They're not going to believe him. But again, the video evidence contradicted her. White people sometimes seek forgiveness because of a failure to deal with their racism. Forgiveness that is, attempted too quickly, too easily, not necessarily, obviously, a good thing, right? There's a process for forgiveness here. And certainly this woman, it was inappropriate. What she did was crazy. It was nuts. And she doesn't, I mean, the young boy was right. She needs help. And she has to deal with her own racism. And that's really the underlying issue. The forgiveness can obscure that. There is a problem here. Those who were shot in the church in Charleston, there's a problem. That somebody, was it an individual problem? Was it a climate that was created? It's something that we have to look at. What allowed that to happen? Forgiveness is great. It's wonderful. It can be appropriate. But important that we examine the underlying problem, the problem of racism. Example in terms of the Dalits in India, right? A fellow who's a PhD in America, still looked down upon by the upper caste. Followed in stores, hassled by shop owners. He went in, he got a pair of sneakers. The sneakers were too big. He didn't want to take up the store owner's time and exchange the sneakers. Just took the sneakers. But they were too big. But all this suspicion. I am a Dalit from the Untouchables. I'm kind of used to this type of behavior, and again, the effects that can have on a person. The author of the book Caste, Isabel Wilkerson, how she was treated on a late evening flight. She mentions that a white man was pressing his body into her. As the plane landed, he wanted to get off quickly, so there he is pressing into her. The flight attendant refused to help her with her bag, because her wrist was hurt. Another example she uses is a doctor of Vietnamese background who was on a plane and was asked to get off the plane, and he had his ticket and everything, and he had to be on that plane because there was a patient that he had to help. But he was Vietnamese, and it was thought that he could be dragged off the plane and again replaced with somebody else. And it's like, well, I have to be on this plane. It's important. And he stood up for that. And again, because he was different, of a different caste, he was treated in an inappropriate way. She used another example of a fellow from Nigeria who developed high blood pressure and diabetes in America. Nigeria, he was fine, no problem. When it comes to America, and again, the stress in terms of being black, and the discrimination he felt, the prejudice he felt, because he was from a different caste. Again, how this affected him. Very interesting. Prejudice itself can be deadly. When a white person who scores high on a scale of automatic prejudice encounters a black person, cortisol can be released, and it can do damage, literally do damage to the heart muscles. So again, this feeling of prejudice. There's a physical aspect to it, as well as just the emotional aspect, the psychological aspect, the social aspect, physically, how it can affect us, prejudice, Isabel points out. The amygdala can be triggered, and the white person can feel threatened. Again, there's a threat, a certain area in the brain, there's a threat because the person is black. Well, I mean, there's no rational way you can say, well, just because you're black, you're going to be a threat. But again, how prejudice can work on us. Telomeres, premature aging of cells, can be caused by stress. Job loss, discrimination, and obesity. So all of these things can have a physical effect. And it's referred to as weathering. So again, a person who either experiences discrimination or discriminates, again, the physical effect that can have. Middle-class African American men, for example, and women, they're more likely to suffer from hypertension and stress than lower-income African Americans. So you say, well, racism has been overcome, they're doing well, there's no problem, and now they, again, are affected by this. So very interesting how the stress can have this negative effect on them. The same applies to Mexicans, the wealthiest Mexicans, versus those who are newly arrived or poor. Again, they are more likely to suffer from hypertension. High levels of discrimination lead to the narrowing of blood arteries over time, and this can lead to heart disease, as David R. Williams points out. Visceral fat surrounds vital organs and raises the risk of diabetes and cardiovascular disease and leads to premature death for people of all ethnicities based on discrimination. And those at the bottom of the caste system have a lower life expectancy than even their white counterparts. I'd say why? They're both, in a way, not doing well, in terms of, poverty and all the struggles that they're having. But even so, African Americans a lower life expectancy than similarly placed white counterparts, in terms of economic and all sorts of other factors, similar but yet lower life expectancy. The outer place principle of social dominance. Isabel speaks about that and says the more affluent African Americans live shorter lives than others. They made it. It's great. It's wonderful. But their lifespan is shorter. What causes that? Again, the physical effects of the racism. Speaks a lot about the Obama effect in terms of all of this, because people will always point to the fact, we elected an African American as president, therefore there is no discrimination in America. And certainly, that was an important historical milestone. But Isabel says, let's look at that in a deeper way and see what was happening there. In the Obama election, only 43% of whites voted for him in 2008, 39% in 2012. Again, what does that say? Only 39% of white people. In Mississippi, only 1 in 10 white voters voted for him. 1 in 10. Civil War divisions still remain in terms of, our electoral politics. Since 1964, no Democrat running for president has won a majority of the white vote, and LBJ had predicted that. Jimmy Carter, in 1976, again from the South, won only 48%. So it's good to reflect on some of these factors that Isabel points out in the book and say, well, what does this say about us? And of course, we look at it in a personal way and say, what does this say about me and my attitudes towards racism and towards the caste system?